From Washington, the Capitol Gang.
Welcome to Capitol Gang. I'm Mark Shields with Al Hunt, Robert Novak, and in New York, Margaret Carlson. Our guest is former Republican presidential candidate Gary Bauer. It's great to have you back, Gary.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you. Israeli Defense Forces continuing to target suspected Palestinian terrorist leaders assassinated their most prominent target so far, Mustafa Zabri, the chief of the Radical Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
This is not the law of the jungle. This is pure act of self-defense.
I think just reflects that the government of Israel is out of control. It's a train without brakes.
The U.S. State Department stressed its disapproval.
We remain opposed to targeted killings. We think Israel needs to understand that targeted killings of Palestinians don't end the violence, but are only inflaming an already volatile situation and making it much harder to restore calm.
Secretary of State Colin Powell later protested the armed Israeli movement into a Palestinian-ruled zone to Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. Al Hunt, does this look like a real break by the U.S. with Israeli policy?
No, Mark, the problem is there is no Bush policy in the Middle East. It's ad hoc, it's ABC, anything but Clinton. And that's not sufficient. Colin Powell, Secretary of State, has been there one time in 8 months. One diplomat said it was more like a drive-by schmooze rather than a real trip. Every Secretary of State wants to avoid the Middle East because it'll suck you in. It's time-consuming. It's a quagmire. Jim Baker wanted to avoid it. Madeleine Albright did, but you can't. It's inevitable. It's the guts of American foreign policy. Current situation, I think you can say two things. The Oslo peace process is dead, and there is no moral equivalency. What the Palestinians are doing are random terror and murder of innocents. But without a U.S. involvement, actively prodding and pressuring both sides, it is only going to get worse. At some point soon, the president has to appoint a special envoy to replace the nearly indispensable Dennis Ross. But first, he's got to get a policy.
Bob Novak, is there a policy? Is Al Hunt right?
I think there's a divided policy. I think Al Hunt is wrong in that he's mouthing the conventional wisdom of Washington and the Clinton holdovers of say, do the same thing we did. Well, they ended up with General Sharon in charge, and that's what the disaster is. In the first place, you have, on the one hand, the president and the vice president, Mr. Bush and Mr. Cheney, who almost are saying attaboy to the Israelis, go get them, go get those Arabs. The other hand, Secretary of State Powell and the State Department are saying this is terrible. You're never going to win this war with targeted assassinations. Now, the problem is that Mr. Boucher, the spokesman, reading in a monotone off a sheet of paper is not giving the proper a level of indignation that the Secretary of State would give, or better even still, the President would give. I don't think it's the time now, Al, to have a negotiation, but for goodness sake, it's time for the United States of America to say that we do not in any way condone targeted assassinations. It's against the law in this country, ought to be against the law in Israel.
Gary Bauer.
Mark, look, the State Department for 30 years has had a foreign policy that goes on whoever's president, and it's generally been an anti-Israeli foreign policy, and nothing's changed with Secretary of State Powell being there. If the State Department wants to condemn targeted killings, they can condemn the targeted killings of women and children, which is happening regularly, of Israeli women and children, by Palestinian terrorists. That's why a dance hall was blown up, because they wanted to kill, and they celebrated the fact that women of childbearing age, Jewish women, were killed in that bombing. That's why a pizzeria was blown up, because they knew families with young Jewish children would be killed in that bomb. The United States ought to stick by its ally Israel, and they ought to have an even-handed policy at the State Department and at the White House, standing with the only democracy in the Middle East.
But Margaret Carlson, sticking with Israel is one thing, but doesn't sometimes require a friend to speak candidly to another friend? And isn't the Sharon policy basically a dead end?
Well, condemning a targeted assassination is not to go against Israel. It's that creates a blood debt and just makes the spiral up in violence even worse. The tit for tat that's going on here looks like it has no end because both sides are hardening. Al is right. Oslo is dead. The intervention by Powell just to get Israeli forces to pull out last week got us nowhere except back to some kind of way where you can say, listen, we have to have a ceasefire before we can go forward. Appointing an envoy is the best thing the U.S. could do right now, and it should probably be George Mitchell, whose report lays down a framework to go forward.
Okay, let me just one thing. Dan Ayala on the Sharon advisor this week here in Washington said, that the Sharon government was delighted or was not at all resistant to the United States playing no role there, and that they had heard very little in the way of criticism from the United States government of Israeli policy. And I just feel Israel has lost the high moral ground that it had. I'm not in any way justifying terrorist acts of blowing up children or anything of the sort, but I mean, I think this is a dead end, and I'll tell you the cost is going to be, it's going to be in the moderate Arab states. It's going to be in
Mark, you're absolutely right. And Bob, I don't think that we can go back to Oslo. I don't think you can even have negotiations now, but there has to be an active American presence there. That's the only thing. I mean, however you do it. And there's some on the right in this country, some pro-Israeli types who've said basically the Israelis ought to militarily crush them, they ought to escalate, build a wall around the country. I mean, that may be viscerally satisfying. There may be some moral justification for it, but it won't work. 5 million Palestinians and 95 million Arabs won't disappear.
Listening to people like my friend Gary and some of my brother columnists, Israel, if they take that advice, they are in danger of becoming a rogue nation. And it's very bad for
Bob, in all due respect,
think of what they are around the world.
That is ridiculous. Look, if the United States was routinely suffering civilian casualties of women and children, there is not a president, Republican or Democrat, who would not seek to find the terrorist leaders in charge of those sorts of bombings.
Gary,
for us to sit here in Washington in our nice, comfortable surroundings and second-guess what the country under siege should or shouldn't be doing is outrageous.
Have 4 times as many Palestinians been killed in this situation than Israelis?
When you engage in an uprising in which you're attempting to kill Israeli soldiers, you can expect to be shot at.
Last word, Gary Bauer. Gary Bauer on the Gang will be back with the failing economy, and later, George W. Bush wooing labor. I just think they're recruiting generations of terrorists in perpetuity. In perpetuity. Every time that helicopter, a U.S. helicopter, a U.S. F-16 goes in, Welcome back. The Congressional Budget Office agreed with the Office of Management Budget on a 1.7% economic growth rate for this year.
Our economy began slowing down last year, and that's bad news, and I'm deeply worried about the working families all across the country. According to today's GDP figures, the recovery is very slow in coming.
The Democratic leaders of the Senate and House wrote the president expressing, quote, our serious concerns about the deteriorating condition of the federal budget and the nation's economy, end quote. Bob, what is the political impact of the failing economy?
Well, it's really bad news for President Bush and the Republicans. If you subtract the growth of government is growing fine all over the country, local, state, and federal. If you subtract that, we're in a recession now. We're in a private sector recession. We have a negative growth rate if you take away the government spending, and there's nothing being done to help it because we are still in a tight money policy at the Fed. The kind of tax plan they passed didn't do much to help, and on the Hill, I've been in this town for 40 years, and they always debate the wrong things on the Hill when the economy's in trouble. They're talking about these scholastic arguments about how many angels can dance on the head of a budget, and it just is. I think I am really worried that we're entering the same kind of period Japan's been in, where they have had 11 lean years.
Margaret Carlson, what's your assessment politically of the bad economic news?
Well, let me tell you, from up here in New York, people think there is a recession, which Bush, by the way, calls incredibly, quote, incredibly positive news. And then at the same time, he says, but next year is going to be fine because we're going to bottom out and corporate earnings are going to come back and the economy will revive. He likes the straitjacket because it puts a hold on spending, so he thinks. But you know, it's a straitjacket for him as well. He hasn't explained where he's going to find the money for the things he wants to do. And I knew that we were really in a recession when I was making an airline reservation, and it turns out that the airlines have pulled back on their draconian policy of 7-day advance purchase Saturday night stayovers because their business is so far down. You can't ignore the signs. Consumer spending is still going, but who knows for how long. And Bush is going to regret this straitjacket as soon as Congress gets back and he's trying to pass his defense spending.
Gary Bauer, I think it shows George W. Bush is enormously flexible ideologically. He was for a tax cut because we had this cascading surplus, and we had to get this money back to the taxpayers and the productive element of our society, led by Bob Novak. And now the tax cut is the case because the economy's gone south on him and it's sour. I mean, either way, he's for a tax cut, and there's not much left else for anything else.
Well, now look, Mark, the idea of running a surplus when the economy is plummeting is a silly idea. The reason we wanted to have a surplus during good times is so that we would have money available on a rainy day. This is a rainy day. I agree with Bob that we need lower interest rates. We also need, quite frankly, to use some of the $150 billion that's left, get that money back in circulation, return it to American families, American investors, American business, and that will give us the growing economy I think everybody wants.
But Al, I mean, Gary says you got to get this in circulation, but my goodness, every Republican leader on the Hill and the House stood up there and said, we're not going to touch a single gray hair on the sacred head of Social Security, pal.
That was stupid.
Stupid.
Now they're going to do what Governor Earl Long did in Louisiana. They're going to say, I lied.
I was going to say.
Mark, look, a failing economy always hurts the party in the White House. We all know that. That's always the case. So the debate here really is an alphabetical one. Will it be a U-shaped downturn, gradually down a little bit, then gradually up, or will it be V-shaped, dramatically down, dramatically up? The politics are interesting, those two. If it is V-shaped, if it goes down sharply and then bounces back sharply in a couple of years, it'll hurt the Republicans in 2002, probably cost them the House, and then help Bush in 2004, a la Ronald Reagan. If it's U-shaped, it'll have much less effect. Finally, you got to look at the global economy. And Bob Novak, I think, has very unfairly criticized Alan Greenspan, who 7 times has cut interest rates by a total of 3 percentage points. The Fed funds rate is down 3 percentage points this year. The Central Bank of Europe has only made 1 cut. The Bank of Japan is fumbling as always. Those are 2 of the villains in this story.
Since my name was mentioned,
your name was mentioned.
Gary, you're wrong. It isn't just cutting interest rates. It's also what we have to do is we have to start targeting. We have a deflation. We have to start targeting commodities. We have to have a whole different monetary policy because we're in great trouble. You know, Japan got its interest rate down to 0,
right?
And they still have a recession.
You misheard me, Bob. I agreed it's got to be more than cutting interest rates. We also have to get the economy moving with capital gains tax cuts and other things.
And I'll tell you this: if we go into a real recession, the idea of they're talking about one difference, 1 seat gain, 1 seat loss.
Right.
We're talking about 30 seats lost by the Republicans. This could be a Republican disaster, and I don't see the urgency at the Bush administration when they talk about this nonsense of 3.2% growth rate next year.
You just heard it.
Believes it's going to be 3.2.
No, you just heard it from Bob Novak, and let's be clear about one thing, Al. That is, George W. Bush isn't up until 2004, but there's a lot of Republicans that are up next November. Next on Capitol Gang, Labor Day, Republican style. I just...